Raising Readers, Encouraging Boys Who Struggle to Read. Welcome to the Mothers of Boys Survival Guide podcast, where we dive into the wild, wonderful, and sometimes chaotic world of raising boys. Whether you're knee-deep in dinosaurs or navigating teenage moods, we're here to offer real talk, expert advice, and plenty of encouragement.
We know that getting boys excited about reading can be a challenge. And if your son is struggling, it can be hard to know where to start. That's why we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Jessica Hovland to the conversation. Dr. Hovland brings over 15 years of experience in special education with a deep focus on language and literacy development in children of all ages. She holds 2 master's degrees, one in inclusive special education and another in social studies education, as well as a PhD in special education. Her career has taken her from high schools in Buffalo, New York, and the Chicago Public Schools to the University of Northern Colorado, where she now teaches future educators. Beyond the classroom, Dr. Hovland is a proud mom to 2 adventurous, high-energy boys who are master Lego builders with wonderfully unique temperaments and interests. She brings not only professional insight, but also a parent's perspective. And she's here to share practical, encouraging tips to help your kids engage with reading and grow into more confident readers. So welcome, Dr. Hovland. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yes, welcome. So many of our listeners have requested this topic, so we're happy to have you here. And before we get started, I just want to know, what would you like us to call you? Dr. Hovland, or?
You can just call me Jessica, and I'm happy to be here, so thanks for having me.
Well, before we dive into to the serious stuff, I have a very important question. Have you ever stepped on a Lego in the middle of the night?
I've stepped on too many Legos to count. Yes, we do. Constant struggle. The Legos are everywhere.
What's the most impressive thing your kids have ever built?
So I think they've built quite a bit. My older son, I actually have asked him, what do you think is the best thing you've built? And he said that the Lego Technic is monster truck was really challenging to build. And he has not taken those apart. Those are on his dresser because they were so challenging.
So Jessica, data from the National Assessments of Educational Progress consistently shows that girls outperform boys in reading at every level. And the surveys also suggest that boys are less likely to read or see it as valuable, unless, of course, it's Lego directions. And and they're more likely to, face reading related issues like dyslexia or language processing disorders. So, really from your professional opinion, why do you think boys struggle more?
So I think this is a decades old problem that researchers have noticed, teachers have noticed, and then because it's published, parents have noticed and worried. It is true. That's what the data shows. It's especially true for males of color. And some of the reasons behind that, I think from my experience and from also reading the research, is really when you think about little boys, and I know you've talked about it in previous podcasts and in your book, they're active and they're active learners. And reading, especially sometimes the way it's taught in schools, is sitting, focusing, paying attention. And if it's hard for little boys to sit and pay attention, then it becomes hard for them to focus and learn to read because they're missing pieces of it. Sometimes boys just take a little bit longer to develop language. Girls are just naturally sometimes more verbal, and they develop language sooner. It's not always true for every single boy. It's just on average. But that's also plays into it. There's also a higher rate of disabilities generally in boys just because of the way traits are inherited biologically. And so that's also plays a little bit of a role. I think there's more boys in special education, and the primary need in special education for kids who need that is reading skills. So it's a big focus, and it's been for a long time at the national level all the way down to the local level.
So, Jessica, given those challenges, do you have some practical tips or strategies for parents, especially moms, to help their sons become more confident and engaged readers at home?
Sure. I think the earlier you can start, so if you have a little boy who's a baby, just start introducing books. Books, they have bathtub books, board books, get them used to seeing them, how books work. Um, have them see you reading. That's a big one that people sometimes forget is being a model. So, and this is where you can also bring in dads right from the beginning, where boys are seeing their dads read. Um, when I was growing up, my dad always read, the paper and newspaper in the morning. He didn't really read books, but we did always see him read. I never thought about it until I was a professional. And now we read a lot on electronics, and so it's not as obvious that reading's happening. So, I've encouraged my husband to get books, read to the kids sometimes, even though I do most of the reading, and then have them see him read a novel or a book that's not on the phone so they know they actually see him reading. When you're reading to kids, I make it part of our bedtime routine. I have since day one, where we just spend 20 to 30 minutes reading and I read aloud to them. And when they're little, it's just fun. And so they start associating reading books with being close to mommy or daddy, having that special time, listening to a story. And so it's a great way to start. If you don't already have that routine, it's not too late. You can still start it.
Hmm.
Um, and then when you're reading, you can ask questions. So not necessarily quizzing them, but just say, oh, wait, what's this character's name again? Or who is this character? Why do you think he did that? And just getting them verbally engaged as well to talk about the story with you. So those are things you can do that are just enjoyable and it doesn't feel like learning. As they get older, and even when they're in preschool, taking trips to the library and just letting them explore different types of books, and then finding what they gravitate towards. So my kids love animals, and so we've always had animal books. As they've gotten older, they like to read things that help them learn. So they have become really into Minecraft, which is very popular right now. And so sometimes they'll take books for how to play Minecraft. And so they'll read how to do things.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
both of my kids actually also have struggled to learn to read. They've had language delays. And so I found it super helpful to um, provide visuals as much as I can. So picture books, graphic novels, anything that, and then movies. So a lot of chapter books now, like Harry Potter is a huge series that's come back in full force from
Hmm.
several decades ago. And so I still read those books out loud to them, and then we watch the movie and we talk about, are there differences? But it helps them get that visual, and it's also a little bit more motivating. Um,
Right.
One other trick is if they're a little self-conscious and you want them to start reading out loud more, is to have them read to a pet. And so they can
That's
sit and read next to a dog. The dog doesn't criticize them, it doesn't correct their words, but it
yeah.
gives them a little bit of a companion. Maybe a goldfish or a cat would work too, if that's what you have in your house.
Be a
um,
goldfish,
I
right?
think that I wish I would have thought of that back when my kids were young. That would have totally worked.
You bring up Harry Potter,
hmm
and Harry Potter came out when my oldest son
hmm
was of that reading age, the
hmm
first book,
hmm
and he and my husband read it together. I
hmm
mean, not together I mean, they read it at the same time,
hmm
and then they would talk about
hmm
it. That was a great tip, and
hmm
my husband and my son got to bond over Harry
Yes,
Potter, right?
that's great. Yeah, whenever they can do
Yeah.
that. And there are lots of movies that they've now made into children's books too. And being able to
Hmm.
connect, like you said, with their male role model, whether it's their dad or another, older sibling, cousin, uncle, grandfather,
Right.
just is more
Mhm.
powerful motivator to keep reading.
So, if you have a younger, son, child, what's the best way to correct them when they're reading out loud, or do you just not correct them and just encourage them?
I think this is a tough question, and you have to kind of feel out how open your child is to being corrected, I think, as well. So if they're very sensitive to criticism, it may not be something you want to do. Once they're in school, a lot of teachers will want your child to be reading every night, and they'll say, read 10 minutes a night in kindergarten, read 20 minutes a night, read 30 minutes a night. And so when they're reading for school and when they're reading things that maybe their teacher sent home, you want to make sure they're getting it correct. One thing that I found is kind of helpful is I let them finish their thought because nobody likes being interrupted, right? So I let them
Hmm.
finish the sentence. If they don't self-correct, so if they don't say, wait, in their head, they're thinking that doesn't make sense, I must have missed a word, which happens as they get a little bit older. So my older son will do that now. My younger son still does not. And so I will go back and say, wait, I didn't hear that word quite right. Can you say that again for me? Or what are the letters in this word? Let's sound this one out together after they're done. And that way I make sure he's actually getting the word correct and paying attention to each letter to sound out, but he's not being interrupted or criticized in the middle of his reading.
That's such a great tip. And my mom was a kindergarten teacher, and she gave me that tip when I was interviewing kids as
Hmm.
a producer.
Hmm.
And she would say that she said I would pretend to be either deaf or dumb.
Uh-huh.
So I'd either say I didn't hear it
Yep.
or I didn't understand it. What do you mean by that?
Right.
And then I mean, if you can't hear it, they're like, well, let me explain.
Right.
And then they get, deep into it.
Yes.
So
Jessica, what are some of the early warning signs that a child may be struggling with reading?
Mhm. Well, one of the um, things when you're have a young child in preschool to keep an eye out on are speech and language delays. So any child who has
Hmm.
any kind of speech and language delay is considered or at risk for developing later reading delays or literacy struggles because they're all part of the language processing parts in the brain. And so that would be early intervention is best. So if you notice your child struggling with speech and language, um, get them help into speech language therapy. That's my first piece of advice because that can prevent reading difficulties later. Sometimes
Hmm.
there's something called Child Find when your child's in very young, and they will help through the school district. They will help provide services, but you have to be score really low on tests to qualify for those services. So, um, my kids were kind of on the border of qualifying, and so we did end up doing private speech and language therapy for several years. And so that got them in a place where I knew they were hearing sounds and they were saying them correctly because if kids are not saying their sounds correctly, they're not going to spell them correctly and they're not going to sound out words
Hmm.
correctly. And so that's kind of one of the first warning signs. Some parents get a little worried if their kids reverse letters. They think, oh, my child might have dyslexia, which is a word reading disability because they're mixing up their B's and their D's. And that's actually developmental, and most kids will grow out of that. So that's not necessarily a red flag at first because it's pretty normal for kids to do that in the beginning. If they're still doing that in second and third grade, it may be a cause for concern. One of the things that you could also look for in their language is if they're flipping word parts, if they're having trouble rhyming. So, one thing my son would do in his car seat, instead of calling it a cup holder, he would call it a hold cupper. And it's really cute because he would say hold cupper.
Oh.
Um, but as he did that with a few more words, I was like, okay, this is probably something that's going to be challenging when he starts reading and flipping, whole parts of words. So those are some signs when they're doing that frequently and consistently that maybe there might be some difficulties. The other thing is a lot of schools do universal screeners now, and so at starting in kindergarten, you will get scores sent home for children's literacy skills and their math skills. And you'll have a pretty good idea. And I wouldn't worry about one test, especially the first one in kindergarten, because Some students don't know how to, they're computerized now, a lot of them, and the kids maybe don't know how to do that. So they have to get used to test taking. But if you're noticing consistently lower scores where they're kind of at the 25th percentile or below, that may be an indicator that there's some things they're struggling with. And I think schools have gotten a lot
Hmm.
better at identifying this early. But as a parent, that's definitely one piece of data that you will get from schools that can be really helpful.
Interesting. If,
Yeah.
I'm curious in your experience,
hmm
who usually is catching the difficulty? Is it the parent or the school or the teachers in the schools typically?
I think it depends. I think that, parents have different expectations when they see some of those test scores that I was talking about. So some parents may see a 50th percentile, which is completely average and normal, but they may want their child to be at the 80th or 90th percentile. And so they may think there's a
Okay.
problem when there's really not, you know. And then some
Hmm.
kids development is a huge range. And so some kids are ready to read at 5, others not till 7, and that's just the way their brains are growing. And so I wouldn't really be concerned until after 7 years old if they're still having trouble with basic sounding out words. Um, so I think that if you're really reading with your child every day, you're probably going to notice if it's hard for them, or if they are consistently saying, I don't want to read, you read it for me. It might be really hard for them.
Right.
If they're having trouble paying attention in school, sometimes it can come out in behavior a little bit, and then the teacher might notice, but they may not know why. Um, so when teacher said to me about my son, oh, he doesn't pay attention, he's not focusing, and it actually turns out he was just processing language a little bit slower. And so what appeared to be difficulty focusing was him losing his place because he was kind of a second behind in his ability to process
Hmm.
language, and that made it he was missing. He was missing instruction, and then he would get frustrated and um, accused of not paying attention when really he just wasn't able to keep up with the pace of instruction because of the way his brain processes language. So even if teachers notice something, it may be not the root problem. And so sometimes it just requires digging from a team of parents, teachers, and bringing in even some psychologists to help with additional testing if you need to.
I found in elementary school, my boys were not interested in reading
hmm
really. They prefer to do
hmm
Legos. I mean,
hmm
run around outside, do
Yeah.
do whatever.
hmm
And the girls, their friends that were girls,
hmm
were very into reading.
hmm
And so, as a parent, it made me concerned that they were kind of falling behind. So, I decided that some of it was just this girl boy thing. So, to make reading more fun, right around third or fourth grade, I reached out to all the moms of my older son, and we created a boys only book club. And at that
hmm
time, Spiderwick Chronicles had just come out. And so we read the Spiderwick Chronicles, which are kind of the precursor to Harry Potter. But they're just these beautiful, beautiful little leather bound books, and they have illustrations in them and
hmm
short chapters. And all the boys would read the book, and then they'd come on over and we'd sit around our table,
hmm
and I would give everybody snacks and drinks, and then we each person had to say one thing they liked or didn't like about
hmm
the book, the fairies, the gremlins, whatever. And that was it. That was the end of the book club, and then they went out and they played, and all the
hmm
moms got to hang out. So you know it turned into just a very, very positive
hmm
experience
hmm
for them. And I did it again with my second son. And in fact, we even involved the entire elementary school, and
hmm
they had a little TV studio in the elementary school. And so
hmm
I met with the librarian, and we had a contest from the third, fourth, and fifth graders
hmm
to do video book reports. And then the best one was
Hmm.
shared to the school as
hmm
sort of the prize. And and it was just a lot of fun. It made
Mhm.
the reading much more interactive and fun, and
Mhm.
they were kind of off to the races after
Yeah.
getting over, I think, that initial fear.
Yeah. I love that idea. I thought that was so clever and just really probably really motivating for your kids because of the social aspect. And I think that's what
Yep.
a lot of research has found too, especially as kids get older and that social piece becomes more important to them when they're in school. Anytime you can make anything you're learning social and motivating and interesting, I think kids are more likely to do it and get teachers involved in that
Right.
too. I will say with some kids, if it's more of a motivation issue, those types of things are wonderful. If they actually have trouble just accessing the words, then,
Hmm.
when they're a little younger, it can be a little bit harder because then like, well, I can't read, so I need help with this. Um, One thing that I've done with my kids that was kind of similar is um, because they really like animals. So over the summer, they would pick one animal to kind of research, and they would go to the library and get a book, and then they would actually write a little, kind of like you were saying, but write a little book of their own
Hmm.
about the animal,
Hmm.
and then they would read that book that they wrote to our family members. So,
Oh,
um,
that's very fun.
yeah,
Okay, so
so
this is
they,
why this is why I only have two readers out of four
yeah.
kids. I did not do those things. I
Well,
did not do those things.
Well, they
These are all
were their
wonderful
first
ideas.
inspiration. Yeah, their first inspiration was
Well,
horseshoe crabs in at the Jersey
Ah,
Shore, which is an animal we don't have in Colorado, and most people have never seen. And so
right.
it was fun because they got to. It was now they had this book that they had written. They learned so much, so they could go and talk about it with other people and teach other people. And that's really when kids can feel successful in their reading or any literacy skill, then um, it motivates them to keep wanting to do it more, or at least be willing to do more. So
Right.
focusing kind of like what you did,
Uh,
that social motivation, and then also feelings of success with literacy helps them to get more into it and be more willing to try harder tasks.
I, l- I love that you got them interested in the library as part of that, because
Yes.
the library has great programs too, summer reading
Hmm.
programs,
Hmm.
and and we had a lot of success at our local library.
Our libraries, and even during the school year, they have reading charts that they do each month. And so kids can mark
Hmm.
off, those are pretty popular, mark off the time. Some kids, this is really motivating for other kids. So I have one child that is really into the charts and he likes marking his reading. I have another child that just forgets and it doesn't work. The charts
Hmm.
don't work for him. But if they do work, they're a great incentive and they can earn things too. So that's another way to motivate kids. And the library gives
Hmm.
out prizes for free, so you don't even have to buy them prizes.
Right. I I had boys, um, that were gravitating towards joke book
Hmm.
and Captain Underpants
Hmm.
and graphic novels, and
Hmm.
I was worried about
Hmm.
that. I mean, all the fart jokes. I mean, how many can you get away with at one time, right? Um, and I also had an abundance of sister-in-laws, and one of my sister-in-laws gave me some really great tips at that
Hmm.
time. One of them was let them read whatever they want to read, whether it's a graphic novel or Captain Underpants, it doesn't matter. The other tip that she said was turn on closed captioning,
Hmm.
which we did.
Hmm.
And we pretty much left closed captioning on for the majority of their childhood. And
Hmm.
I think it made them faster readers,
Hmm.
subconsciously.
Hmm.
Whatever show they were watching,
Hmm.
the words were on the
Hmm.
screen. So, what's your take on that?
I think those are both great pieces of advice. And I think sometimes we think of reading almost too narrowly. We think of it, it has to be a book and it has to, look a certain way. And I think when we think about really the broader aspect of literacy, we can think well beyond, just a traditional book. Traditional books are great. But graphic novels have their own um, format and their own really flow, even a little bit different
Hmm.
than a traditional novel. And so learning different ways to communicate and getting information different ways is actually really great, I think. And literacy goes, especially now in our digital age, goes so much beyond just reading, the black and white print. We can be
Hmm.
reading pictures. Sometimes one of my sons will say, "Oh, I'm reading the pictures of the book." And it's true. He's reading the pictures because they're telling a story. And so it's not that
Right.
word phonics-based reading that we kind of associate. But literacy is so much more than that, especially now in our digital age when we can have podcasts and we can have,
Hmm. Hmm.
movies and so many different ways of communicating with language.
So I know some kids get, stuck on a series, or they
Hmm.
they just love reading a certain genre of book. But
Hmm.
maybe if their skills to advance, how
Hmm.
do you encourage them to try to change, what they're used to reading, to just kind of challenge them more, also kind of, giving them the freedom to choose the book.
Yeah, I think anytime you can incorporate choice, and so kids, adolescents have a feeling of control a little bit, that they can control a little bit
Mm-hmm.
of it, is really important. And so even so you could still pick a couple of books and then give them a choice, and they all are meeting what you're thinking is kind of the next step in their reading development, but maybe they don't know that. They're still getting to pick. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I found that, especially with boys, and the research has found this too, that anything that has action, sometimes nonfiction, um,
Hmm.
historical fiction, um, for whatever reason, boys tend to gravitate toward those types of things. And it doesn't necessarily have to be specific to what they're already doing. So I just started reading, maybe a little unconventional, but I loved The American Girls when I was little. And I love reading, like I was that definitely a reader as a girl and still am. And I still have the books. And so I said to my boys, I said, well, these are the books I loved reading when I was your age. Why don't we try them? And so um, I've actually read quite a few of them now, and they're the older ones, so they're historical fiction. But they're
Hmm.
actually quite action packed. So even though the character is a girl and it's about their life as a 9 or 10-year old. It's the same age as my kids, and the girls are all very active and they're learning history. And so it's been really fun for
Hmm.
me to share that with them. So, and have that connection, and then also see them actually be interested in what's going to happen next because there's a little bit of mystery. And so I've kind of tricked them into reading a girl book about history because
Well done.
yeah,
That's awesome.
because it has enough of the action. And then
Right.
the other thing I try to do is connect it to other things. Again, like you said, going outside, doing things they like.
One of the things I always did when my kids were in school, even though I worked, was I would go in and volunteer to read in the
Hmm.
classroom.
Hmm.
Even in middle school, they had that opportunity. And it was a great thing to volunteer for because it was like an hour. I mean,
Hmm.
even with a busy, committed schedule, you can get in there, you can promote reading, you can watch your kids interacting. And
Hmm.
so that was definitely a win
Hmm.
all the way through. So, shifting to a little bit older
Hmm.
child
Hmm.
in high school, the understanding is everybody knows how to read, and now
Hmm.
we're going to throw large volumes of
Hmm.
material at you and expect you to read it in a very short period of time. And my second son, who I call the boys earnest and exuberant. So exuberance was always very good at spotting the loophole or figuring out a way to
Hmm.
make it work for him. And he was not a very fast reader. And so I found him once in his bedroom, and he was listening to the book on tape
Hmm.
at double speed or one and a half
Hmm.
speed while he had the book open,
Hmm.
following it and reading it.
Hmm.
And I thought, that's pretty smart. Was that a good idea?
I think so, yes. It's something we do a lot for high schoolers is find those audiobooks, and they've become actually fairly mainstream now. People like listening to books on tape in the car and maybe when they're, commuting, even adults. I think what I love about the idea is that he was following along with the print. So I think that's an
Hmm.
important piece, an important factor. Um, and we use them a lot with high school students in on the special education side, but it's not limited to that. If it helps them, it's all reading. So I think that's great.
Hmm.
One thing I would recommend for high schoolers, especially because sometimes kids just have challenges with reading, but sometimes it's also just a broader language processing, is to make sure they stop and take a couple of notes on what they just heard or read. And so that's one thing I always tell my high school students, okay, you just went through 2 pages, stop, get a sticky note. What were some of the key ideas you just read? And then keep that sticky note right in
Hmm.
that spot in the book. And that way, um, you know, a common thing I hear from some teenagers who struggle is, well, I read it, but I have no idea what I just read. I just spent 30
Right.
minutes
Hmm.
looking at this article or book and I don't know what it says. But stopping every couple of pages, every 10 minutes, and jotting down highlights, then you have it written down. Your brain's processing it, so you're more likely to remember it. And then they have it as a reference later, so that if they forget it a couple hours later, or the next day at school when they're being asked a question about it, they have that reference.
I love what you were just saying about the sticky notes too,
Hmm.
because if they have to do a book report,
Hmm.
doesn't that speed that whole process up a
Right.
whole bunch? Is you
Mhm.
just go through all your little sticky notes.
Right. And a lot of times in high school now, they're asked to pull evidence from different sources and then,
Hmm.
synthesize it into an essay. That's a huge skill in high school that is worked on across content areas. And so being able to also, this is the one thing I like about print, but you can highlight in iPads, I guess, is underlining and taking notes, while you're reading and just write in the text,
Hmm.
write on it with a pencil. So then
Right.
when you have that task of going back and analyzing what you read, again, you already have it right there.
Jessica, when your child is struggling at school and it is affecting their behavior in the classroom and also their self confidence, what can the parent, particularly the mom, do to address that at home?
Well, first, I want to say that this is just a really challenging thing to go through. It's really hard to watch your child struggle. Um, and
Hmm.
also, especially if you don't really know the reason. And I just went through this as a parent, so I can empathize with anyone else that's, dealing with that right now. And reading and writing affects every single subject. So if they're struggling with that, it's going to affect everything in school and they're just going to have a hard time. And if it's also related to language processing difficulties, they could also be having a hard time socially. And so it's a really hard thing as a parent.
Hmm.
So I just wanted to recognize that there's not an easy answer to to this question, that it's really
Hmm.
challenging. Um, but I think the first thing is just finding ways to help them be successful in anything. So reading is, if it's hard and it's going to be hard, what else can they be successful in? Is it music? Is it sports? Is it something else that they can feel really confident in? Is it building something? Are they really creative? Are they artistic? And building those skills at the same time so that you're not always focusing on, here's what you're struggling with. Because one of my sons would come home and he couldn't finish his math is very language based now. I'm not sure if you have an elementary school child, you know this, so that it's almost all word problems in a lot of elementary schools, which is really frustrating for kids who struggle with reading and processing language. So he would come home with, several pages of math that he couldn't finish during the day, and then he'd come home with extra reading practice. And so if we did that, my entire time with him after school would just be reinforcing skills that were hard for him, which is not
Hmm.
fun for me or for him, right?
Right.
Um, so we would limit that time. I'd say we'd have 30 minutes that we're going to work on this, and then the rest of the time we're going to do something else that's fun, that you're good at, and then Talk to the teachers. I had several conversations with teachers, and if it's not really going anywhere, you can go outside, ask for testing to figure out what's really going on. That's what we ended up doing, to be honest. Um, but then I also really looked, kind of scoured internet bookstores, libraries for any books that would be kind of at his level that he could feel successful at. And once the feeling of reading a whole book by yourself is so confidence building for kids, whether they're 5, 8, or 16. Reading an entire book by yourself really builds confidence. So if you can find a book, and we ended up finding kind of a Dr. Seuss-like book that was in a graphic novel form, and it had chapters, in quotations, I put that, but it had 9 chapters, and he read the whole thing. And he was so proud of himself that he was more
Right.
willing then to pick up another book. It took a whole year to get there. I'm going to just put that out there. It takes time to build those skills. But when he did that, he was like, oh, I can actually read. Because before he was telling himself,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a reader, I can't read. And so changing that mindset, especially if you can do it when they're in elementary school before they're in high school, by just finding ways to build little successes until they can get to a bigger one, I think is the best way to approach it. That's been my experience.
Even as an
That.
adult, I'm proud of myself when my
Yeah.
book's really big and long.
Yeah.
Like, wow, I finished that.
Yeah.
So, so do you have any suggestions, resources, apps, specialists for struggling readers?
Yeah, I think um, I'm not affiliated with any, certain publisher or anything, so I'm not, definitely not promoting anything for that reason. But there's a lot of research that's been done in reading and writing over the last 20 years. And when you're thinking about, school is really, I think the main job of elementary school is to teach children to read and write. They
Mm-hmm.
should come out of 5th grade knowing how to read on their own. And the Orton Gillingham approach, sometimes called OG for short, is one of the best approaches out there because of the way it teaches kind of breaks the code of the English language for kids who can't figure it out intuitively. And it's hard. I mean, English language is actually one of the hardest languages to learn.
Mm-hmm.
So in an elementary school, they should be using some version of that type of approach to teaching. And you can ask as a parent, I would ask, so if you're even thinking of a literacy tutor, I would ask and make sure they're using a program that is backed by research and connected to this approach if your child's struggling. From a home perspective, some things that I've found really helpful are Bob books, and these are for emerging, preschool, kindergarten, 1st grade, because they start with just the alphabet and just letter sounds. They have really simple drawings so that they're not distracting because that can sometimes be. I didn't say this previously, but my other son does not like graphic novels because he finds them really hard to follow and really distracting. So again, it kind of depends on, how
Mm-hmm.
kids focus when they read. But the Bob books are a great place to start. And if you're a parent that also likes to have your child do a workbook just to keep them, spelling and writing, because that helps build all of literacy skills, they have companion workbooks and you can find them pretty much anywhere. Target, Amazon,
Mm-hmm.
all of the places. So I think that's a good place to start if you feel like you need to build some skills, reading, learning to read skills in your young child. As they get older, there's so many books out there now and so many choices, it can be overwhelming. But I've found that the schools usually partner with Scholastic. Probably people have heard of that company. And
Mm-hmm.
they have phonics collections. And I prefer those because their words are in all of the books follow certain phonics patterns. And so it's easier for kids if they're learning certain patterns to then read those books. Um, so basically, anything that says phonics or decodable texts are really helpful for kids to struggle to learn to read who are struggling. So I think those are kind of what I would suggest more from the parent side at home. If you have really little kids, there's tons of alphabet games and, in preschool age, puzzles, multisensory type of things that you can, anytime you can incorporate that, it's going to help build skills without them knowing it. Magnets on the refrigerator are also great. Letters, words.
And I just want to mention that I think I'm going to take all of your tips and create a resource page, so that anyone who's listening to the podcast can get these links and recommendations in a separate resource page.
I was thinking it would be good for our listeners to be sitting there with a pen and a paper this entire podcast, because you've literally given us 100 different tips that are amazing.
So Jessica, thank you for all of those tips. And so we ask all of our guests to share a mantra or a saying or something that might be helpful, to a mom while she's trying to encourage her son to read, or just, calm her heart during this period. Do you have a saying that you would like to share?
I think for moms, it would just be similar to what your sister-in-law said. Read whatever they're willing to read as much as you can. I think for moms. I think if I'm talking from a school perspective, reading is a gateway skill. And if you can read, you can learn almost anything. And so that's something, it's why I do what I do, to be honest, because if you're 14 and you can't read, it's really hard to graduate from high school. And if you can't graduate from high school, that, has a whole other impact.
Wow. So for our listeners, I feel that you have really empowered them with so much great advice and so much wisdom. You obviously have so much experience in this area. I know that our moms out there are going to be able to use all these strategies that you gave us today to help their boys become better readers and more confident and enjoying it more. So thank you so much. This was wonderful. Wonderful having you here.
Thanks so much for having me be here.
And thank you all for joining us today. Follow The Mob on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and your favorite podcast platform. Be kind to yourselves, moms, and have a great week.